Hi everyone, my name's Katy McGahan and I'm Curator of Independent Documentary at the BFI National Archive, and I must say it's a real honour to be invited to chair this Working with Archive BAFTA Masterclass, not least because of the outstanding filmmakers we have in our midst who are going to tell you all about the creative use of archive in their work, but just because it's a great opportunity to look at these films which I've been, had the opportunity because of this to study, and just to really sort of think about archive and the different approaches and how it can be used to tell stories. So that's always a great opportunity for me. And I'll be inviting each panellist in turn to talk about their work, and they've kindly selected some clips to illustrate what they're going to say. I should mention at the outset that there's another archive-related masterclass taking place tomorrow at 5 p.m. called Archives and Copyright, a Beginner's Guide. And that one gives guidance more on the practical side of how to access archive, how to look into clearing copyright and the more sort of legal process. This is, if we can kind of like harness this into just talking about the creative use of archive. But I would encourage you to go to the other panel. A colleague of mine, Simon McCallum from the BFI, is on that. So yeah, and at the end we'll have time for you to fire some questions at the panellists, and just quite a crowded room. Just make sure that you use a mic because the session is being recorded, and it'd be great if you do that. So without further ado, let me introduce the panellists. We have to my right, Paul Bell. So Paul Bell comes from an acting background, art history.
There was a while there, yeah. In between there was, stacking shelves at Sainsbury's and,
But the last 10, 15 years have been archive filmmaking. Yep. And he has produced two of the most successful UK documentaries in recent years, Senna, was made in 2010, and Amy was out last year. So I'm sure you've all heard of those. To Paul's right, we have Aaron Brookner. And Aaron's credits include The Silver Goat, 2012, which was the first feature film created exclusively for iPad. Another film made was Black Cowboys, which won the Audience Award at Rochester International Film Festival in 2004. And he's also remasters his Uncle Howard Brookner's 1983 feature, a documentary on William S. Burroughs, called Burroughs the Movie. And he brings his latest film, Uncle Howard, which is closely linked with the other film, to premiere here. And it'll be on tomorrow at 8:15 in the Bertha Doc House Library Theatre. So be sure to catch it. It's absolutely wonderful. And on the right there we have Simon Young, who's Senior Director of Development and Production at National Geographic Channel, serving one of the network's main points of contact for the global production community. And prior to joining the NGC, Simon oversaw the production of Channel 4's headline-grabbing documentaries about the discovery of Richard III, including King in the Car Park, which was one of the highest-rated specialist factual programme in the channel's history. So yeah, I'm going to start questioning, but it's going to be quite a loose conversation, so see the questions as kind of a trigger point to talk about whatever. So Paul, you're a producer, but your usually credit is archive producer, which isn't that. So it'd be good if you could explain.
It's one of the terms I kind of dislike the most, really. I mean, because it's such an ill-defined term within the industry. It's, I mean, I know what I do as an archive producer. When other archive producers are telling me what they do, I sometimes see there's a big disconnect. Especially, kind of television. I mean, I generally work mainly in feature films now, or feature documentaries. and the archive producer role in there on the film Amy and Senna, well, the entire film's made from archive, so it's kind of one of the questions about what an archive producer does is kind of driven by, well, what's the archive? How are we using the archive within that? You know, to me, there's a real distinction between stories which are driven by the archive. You find the story within the archive, and so the archive producer's job becomes very different because of that. Or stories where you've got a script, you kind of know what's going to happen. You're trying to fit archive in and around the story which already exists. You've got your interviews, and you need a shot of, the Queen doing something, and so you find that shot. Whereas the films I generally work on, I'm as much a detective as anything else. I'm out there, I don't know really. We know that, sadly, say with Amy, we know how the story ends, but all the bits in between, and we've taken the decision that we're going to use archive to tell that story. I'm out there trying to find all of those things, all of the materials, but then also the producing side of it, in that, I'm working with a budget, I've got to do all the things that a producer does on a film. So it doesn't, there's a big part of it is being a researcher, but a big part of it then, I sometimes use kind of really grand terms like I'm the first director of the film, because I'm essentially making a film which is 100 hours long, and then we're cutting it down in the edit down to 2 hours. Some directors would hate me using that term about a film that they work on, but we're not, with archive, you're not generally working on a vision, you're not generally working on a script. If it's a film like Amy, you're finding the story within that, so you're dealing with what's visible and what's tangible. So it kind of throws up this kind of awful thing about unseen archive. One of my archive researchers and producers often get called really weird things, like I was called archive gurus, or we're out there finding gold, and we're not. We're finding what actually already exists. We'll show it in a clip from Senna, but all of this material was, it's just there on the shelf, but it's how you use it, and that, it's so an awful lot of, to me, what in my perfect description of what an archive producer is, it's someone who's a really good storyteller, who understands script development, who understands the financial aspects of this, because if you get archive wrong, it can be a very, very expensive mistake. But he's really kind of part detective, but a filmmaker who understands the entire process. You're just making a film without actually picking up a camera, because you do have to understand that. I think I've been doing this long enough now that I define it as kind of, I have an understanding of how the world records itself. So I kind of have more of an idea. If you want to make a film about, pick a subject, it's like, well, I would have an idea of where to go and find material like that, and kind of what material would probably be there. I'm sure Simon knows, is that you dig around in the NASA archives long enough, you get a sense of what's going to be filmed, and so you can, it's not that you know exactly what's there, you're hoping that there's going to be new discoveries, but you get a sense of, what's being recorded and why.
And there must be a lot of serendipity in...
it's that kind of thing. You want to be lucky, but you've got to, it's building up. We were talking about this before, it's like, to me, archive filmmaking is no different to normal documentary filmmaking. If I want to get a good interview with someone, I have to build up a relationship with them. If I just say to you, give me your iPhone, and I'm going to use all the content on there to make a film, you're not going to do that. You're going to, you need to build up trust. You need to build up relationships with people, and I think we'll see that from one of the clips in Amy, that a lot of the material in there is very personal stuff, which they were not just going to hand it over to anyone. I think all of the same rules apply. If you're a good archive producer, you can be a good producer of documentaries. It's no real difference.
Yeah, and we were talking as well earlier about the whole idea of memory, people's memories, and how you might ask them, I'm looking into this episode in Amy's life, can you kind of give me what you've got on that?
Well, it's...
and then,
we, going back to, say, the beginning of when we started making Senna, we weren't going to make Senna as a full archive film. We were going to make it as a normal kind of documentary, I guess, in terms of we're going to have talking head interviews, we're going to do maybe a bit of reconstruction. But because of various reasons, I was essentially just working, finding material on my own for about 6 months before we even had the edit running properly. We realised that the one person, of course, we wanted to interview is now dead. And what we wanted to avoid was interviewing someone else 20 years later trying to tell us what was going through his head, what was happening then. Because as I've often found is that people say that, you know, oh, okay, this happened here and this is what it was like. But then you actually look at the material that exists from the time and there's a real disconnect there. We're in that position where, I won't name the guy, but kind of, you know, a manager of a Formula One team who's very used to being in control and in charge and knowing how things are, and then pointing out, well, excuse me, Mr. So-and-so, actually, here's the video evidence that it's totally different to what you said. So, you know, archive can help, you know, it is, I guess, a bank of memories to a degree, but it's, yeah, I mean, you know, it's like any kind of documentary filmmaker. It's not necessarily the truth, but because it already exists, it has a sense of authenticity that it can help in the memory jogging kind of phase of things.
And I remember when I was first introduced to your work, I was at the London International Documentary Festival at the Barbican, and I saw Senna, you know, opening night launch. Not particularly excited about the theme, motor racing isn't my bag, but first few frames I was just totally enthralled, and I sort of came out of that film thinking, you know, what was it? Why did I have such an emotional engagement there? I mean, obviously fantastic storytelling through footage, but there was kind of something more. You know, I really kind of felt this personal engagement, and there was such sort of potency, and I think, you know, I thought there was just so much close-up around the face and the framing, and I kind of wondered if that was something that was inherent in the footage that you used, or whether you were very conscious of that and cropped.
That very much was, you know, it's so Asif Kapadia, the director, from his, I mean, when I first started that, kind of Asif was, if you've seen any of his work before in drama, it's like, say a film like The Warrior. I mean, it's a beautiful film. Cinematically, it's amazing. And he was kind of expecting, because he'd never made a documentary before, he's kind of like, when are we going to start getting the really cinematic material? And I'm like, okay, it's 4:3 shot for television. And Formula One racing is essentially, you know, if you've ever been to a Grand Prix, it's amazing. It's kinetic, everything. TV, it's all in focus, so you can see the cigarette advertising slowly going round for 2 hours. So, you know, the last thing we really wanted to see was more cars and things like that. But you know, as we started discovering, actually, and when he started talking, he became very enigmatic. You really wanted to listen to this guy. And it was the interviews that were the most important thing. So we realised actually all our talking heads already exist. But it's the process called panning and scanning. And that's it, was very much wanted to make this for the cinema. So we weren't making it for a small screen, trying to make it as big as possible. And so by doing that, you know, you got your 4:3 image, you have to scan into it, which means it kind of, you get these big heads. And that's kind of become a feature, because a similar thing kind of happens in Amy as well. But it's, you know, it's very much a director's choice in terms of, are you going to keep it in the original aspect ratio, or I think with Senna, I think that's why it's one of my favourite things I've ever worked on, because it feels like a movie as much as a documentary. And part of that, I think, comes from the archive, because you're always there in the moment. You're never cutting away to 20 years later and someone telling you what's going on. So I think when it really works, archive is incredibly powerful, because it keeps you in the moment, and it's really short story showing as opposed to storytelling. And, you know, it's that classic thing, you're always, you know, you do a script writing course, it's no, don't tell me, show me, action. And archive does put you back into the action in a way that, you know, it's that classic thing. I mean, when I started working for TV, and I was, you know, producers and directors was like, yeah, I'm going to go and interview this guy. I was like, well, actually, I've got some archive, the original from 10 years ago. It's like, no, I'm a producer. I like having a camera. I'm going to go and interview this guy, because I'm going to get something different. And they oftentimes would. But the archive that I found was only being used just to kind of illustrate something very dull in a way, in terms of, okay, we just need to hammer this home. He mentioned that he was in a tank, show a picture of a tank. you know. So we're kind of the other way around with this. But yeah, the big head thing is almost kind of serendipitous because you have to do it that way. But it's very much Asif's decision that I want to make this for the big screen. We could have kept it 4:3, but you know.
That real sense of immediacy.
I think it's also because it's, you know, he's a bit of a movie star. You know, it's like, and you want to see, you know, if he wasn't the most attractive man, kind of that big head all the way through the film might not have worked so well. But yeah.
And in terms of Amy, I mean, there's the other thing that sort of strikes me about all these, all your films is there's a whole mixture of quite kind of rough footage,
Yeah.
and you know, quite glossy imagery. And I think in all three cases, there's you just sort of overlook that completely. You know,
it's kind of,
you forget
yeah.
it.
I mean, it's interesting because a lot of the material that we put into both films, if we were doing it for TV, it wouldn't actually probably pass the QC. It probably wouldn't, you know, it's like, actually, this just doesn't really work properly. But, I mean, with Senna, it was interesting because we went from, the story begins 82-ish, actually kind of like late 79, 80, but really it's going through 84 through to 94. And that goes from, so we start with kind of Super 8 stuff, there's U-matic, there's Beta SP, by the end you're getting into Digibeta, and there's some High 8 and things like that. Amy does a similar kind of 10-year lifespan where we go from early kind of VHS material through to the beginnings of camera phones, through to the beginnings of social media, which it actually never really helped Amy in terms of that she became this incredibly famous person at the same time that people all around the world became camera people and could record her everywhere she went. You've now got, I mean, we very early on found out that there are certain materials in Senna that, there's a scene in Senna where he's being interviewed by a Japanese reporter and he kind of gives her a kiss on the cheek, and no master material exists of that. Fuji TV wiped those tapes a long time ago, so the only master material was an SVHS tape by a guy called Hiro who lives in Tokyo, who uploaded it to YouTube. And I got him to do a better copy of the one, but it's still SVHS. And when we showed Senna on the IMAX, it was breaking apart quite a lot. But the power, it's the story, is the most important thing. It doesn't matter. I mean, once, and this is where Asif as director really kind of learned his trade, I think, in that he was like, you know, he wanted everything to be beautiful to begin with. That then he realised, actually, it's about the story, and it doesn't matter. And we've now reached that point, I think, where, you know, if you do a film like Montage of Heck, Amy, if you don't have some grainy VHS in there, it's like you haven't done your job properly. It's like, you know, what level are you going into? But now, especially as everything is kind of, you know, we've all got cameras, we've all got recording devices. The irony being that those will all be disappearing, and we're creating an erasable archive, sadly, of the last 20 years. The texture is great. I mean, I love it. I've got a thing for really garish kind of SVHS stuff from the 1980s, but that's just because I spend a lot of time looking at it you know, it's kind of my equivalent of Technicolor. But yeah, to me, it's kind of, I guess it lends it authenticity. It is all about trying to keep you in the moment, regardless of where it's coming from. But perhaps it's that sense of that, you know, it's not just one camera recording something. You're being recorded from all angles, and maybe that works into the two films. You know, especially in Amy, she was being recorded from all angles.
Would it be a good time to show a clip?
Yeah. Yeah. So that's the end of the film. I chose that for lots of reasons. All of the Super 8 stuff was the first piece of archive I looked at that I found really in the film. As I said, when we started Senna, we hadn't, like a lot of feature documentaries, hadn't been properly green lit at the time, and we were still waiting to sign a deal with Bernie Ecclestone, and there's a reason why he's a billionaire, because it takes a long time to get all these things done. So I had lots of time where I was just going around doing what I enjoy doing, finding materials. So we hadn't had any access to the Formula One archive. I found this great archive called the G2 Films Archive in Paris, so I went over to Paris, and the first tape that came out, there's a big stack of digibetas they had, And he went, oh, you wouldn't be interested in that, which of course I'm massively interested in straight away. And it's shots of those really, go-karts whizzing past, doing like really interesting visual stuff. So I went, okay, I'm going to have all of that, and what else have you got? And we took all this material back. You see the press conference where Senna's talking, and everyone is expecting to say Prost or Mansell or one of the other, and he comes up with this guy Fullerton. And lo and behold, actually Fullerton is in this Super 8 footage that we've got. I remember Asif very clearly kind of coming in and went, because that's our coda ending. We were, one of the things as well, we were screening this film all the way through. We had like a 7-hour version, then a 5, and we were screening it to people. People probably wouldn't, the 7-hour version, they probably never want to see it again in their lives. But we tried once actually just having the hard ending where Senna dies, and you have that, his plaque, and it was powerful, but everyone came out wanting to kill themselves. So you got this kind of coda ending, and I remember Asif very clearly saying, I've got this idea, it might be a bit weird, but, we've got this press conference. That press conference is from when he's leaving McLaren, or as we used to call it, it's like when he's leaving the red team to go and join the blue team. We had this colour code, and luckily Senna always had a yellow helmet, so all of the different colours in the film, we could just know that, okay, he's the guy with the yellow helmet on. And he was like, look, I'm going to try this and put these two things together. And to me, it's a perfect example of archive filmmaking, because that's never scripted. He had no idea any of this footage existed. And I became fascinated by Senna and all the interviews. So I just got any interviews with Senna I was getting in. And it was Asif kind of putting those two things together. He's about to say something, but then we've got two bits of footage, put them together, okay, we've got the ending to the film. And that comes about through just being given the chance to go and find the story in the material, as opposed to it being a scripted thing. So yeah, it's kind of the serendipitousness of it, or that we found that footage straight away. But again, it's like both of those two clips have been used somewhere else, but just by changing the relationship.
Context, yeah. Wonderful stuff. Well, we'll come back when we're having more open discussion, but we'll move on to Aaron. Aaron, your story is so interesting because, and so different in that, Paul's just been talking about all that disparate footage that he knows is out there, and he's a master at finding it. Tenacity and passion, I guess. But you knew there was this capsule of footage that you wanted to get your hands on. And there was an obstacle, a poet by the name of John Giorno. But would you like to fill in the gaps there? Because it's such a fascinating story, but the challenge in actually getting this document, and all that footage kind of makes up the film that you eventually made.
Yeah, in the beginning, I had a childhood hero who was my Uncle Howard. And one of the things I wanted to do after I started making films was bring back his movies, which had kind of disappeared. So I started with his first film on William Burroughs. And in looking for a good print or negative of it, we discovered that he had stored, my uncle, the film had taken him 5 years to make, and he had stored everything that he had ever shot in William Burroughs' bunker, which still existed on the Bowery in New York, and was being held by this poet, John Giorno. And so in the beginning we thought, well, we're all friends, it's all cool, and everyone wants to bring this movie back. And I went there, and he had suddenly had a change of heart and didn't want to let me in. And my producer, who's here also at the time, decided, well, maybe this is the story that we're in. This is what the situation is. So while we were fighting and trying to keep getting back into the bunker and trying all the any channel we could possibly get, we kept working and kept looking for things. So I started to find other things my uncle had made, including video diaries and home movies and rehearsal tapes he had made while he was making his last film, Bloodhounds of Broadway, with Madonna and Matt Dillon and this incredible cast, just working with all these people in his loft. And I had gone to Kansas, where the Burroughs estate ended up being, and found 25 quarter-inch safety sound rolls that Howard had made from his magnetic sound tapes. And this came from the Burroughs chunk of my uncle's archive, which represented about half of his career. His career lasted about 10 years, and the Burroughs thing took about 5. So I actually started with the quarter-inch reel-to-reel, transferring that, and basically had this soundscape of 30 hours. And the whole time, while trying to fight to get into the bunker, started working with that. Because the other thing was, it was a big question mark. We didn't know exactly what was in the bunker, and even if it says like negative rolls or this and that, it had been put there in 1983, just sitting on a shelf. So no one had opened the cans. It could be vinegar, really didn't know. So I started working with the sound, which was interesting because it kind of created this soundscape of the whole world, really. And in a way, kind of better than having the visual first, because the sound is always rolling, especially when you have a stoned, 22-year-old sound man named Jim Jarmusch, who was on the crew with my uncle. It was always rolling. So not only was I able to start to picture the world, but I could hear, my uncle, how he was, talking to his crew and talking to Burroughs and, creating the whole world and kind of imagining it. And started putting, different visuals to it, some more experimental stuff I would shoot, or mixing it with music tracks. And in a way, it was those kind of early days, while not able to get into the bunker, that the seeds for the story of Uncle Howard were sown. The other archive, the personal stuff, was gathered up. And I'd say the kind of creative approach to telling the film was, established with experimenting with that audio and interested in breaking things up and what happens when you attach, audio to this visual and bring in this person and playing with different time periods and mixing them all into one. And in some cases, when we got all the footage out and had everything to play with, there were gaps, which you inevitably have. So one important thing that was crucial to my uncle's story was when AIDS came into New York City. My uncle came out of this very fertile New York underground scene, the independent film scene that came out of the late 70s and 80s, which got totally killed by the AIDS epidemic. And my uncle's first video diary entry started when he knew he was HIV positive, and this was in '87. But he never says to the camera, it's not like a confessional or anything like that. So, for example, that moment of when AIDS started to come into the scene and what it would be like to feel like my uncle must have felt with this imposing, impending disease coming in. So in that instance, it was about taking bits of archive, bits of things I shot, different soundscapes, and creating a kind of mood piece, essentially, to try to evoke the emotion of what is this mysterious force, coming in to kind of get us. So I credit the kind of early Burroughs stuff with that. And then finally we did get into the bunker and got the film cans out of there, which started a whole other long process. I mean, it was amazing. I've got 196 negative rolls, work prints, magnetic sound rolls. It's this historic document. What do I do now? So it's and I would go to places with my producer. We'd go to MoMA or archives, saying, okay, we need a pretty good chunk of money to digitize this great historic document. It's got things like the Nova Convention, which no one has seen, with Burroughs and Brian Geisen and Ginsberg, Frank Zappa, Patti Smith, this Philip Glass, this amazing historical document. Okay, well, can we see it? Mm-hmm. Well, no, I need the money. I need your, $50,000 or $25,000, whatever it's going to be Okay, we'll think about it. You know, there was a lot of that, and it was just a huge uphill battle then to
Quest.
yeah, that sort of was just beginning again in a way.
Yeah, and I mean it's you know, people went to seen it, but you know, there's such an emotional attachment as well between you and your uncle, and you described in one other interview I watched as your hero. You were 7 when he died. It's a beautiful moment in the film when you're really small boy and he hands a film camera to you. And, you know, I was so struck by just all the emotional complexity and the layeredness of the film. I kind of wondered at any point, you know, kind of reconciling that strong emotional attachment with, you know, creating some level of objectivity whereby you could just arrange the footage into a narrative. But what you've just described, you know, overwrites that question completely, because it's almost like you worked with it on a very experimental level, and the assemblages and of the footage and the sound, and so you're kind of like in it, in the film, rather than having to say, this is what film am I going to make. You're actually in it. So it's kind of really interesting process.
Well, in that aspect of it, I mean, the Burroughs stuff, that chapter was like immersing it. And then actually when we did finally digitize it, there were no sound logs or anything, and very few slates.
So you had to sync it all.
So we had to manually sync it. And then actually having gone through all those endless hours of audio were really helpful, because I knew roughly where things could be placed. But then the other section, which was, you know, home videos and personal stuff, was, you know, very emotional to get into. It's very hard to look back at home movies. And in the case of this story with my uncle, you know, he died, he was 34, buried on his 35th birthday, you know, just on the rise and doing incredible things, and got cut down, and there was, you know, a huge kind of cloud of, you know, tragedy, obviously, surrounding the whole end. And approaching the home movies, when I found them, was kind of mixed in that emotion. You almost don't want to turn it on. But then it started to become very happy in a way, because you start to see, you know, he's actually full of life, and he's there, and there's family and friends. And it was a real reminder of getting past the death and of celebrating his life, and about the way you can see that he's connecting with people. Even myself at 5 years old, it's putting a picture and sound to these intangible emotions that one has, and it's incredibly gratifying. And in some ways, then it started to become a very happy experience, because yes, there's death, and we'll get to that, and it needs to be addressed, but buried within this kind of death is this incredible life. And so the film is about celebrating that aspect of what you can do with your life when you really, you know, give every minute of treat every minute like it could be your last, and connect to people in a genuine way. And you see the power of leading a life like that. And that started to come through in all the footage, the home movies, the stuff Howard made creatively, and in the people who started recalling what he was like.
So you end up with a much fuller picture.
Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. So yeah, and I mean, it must have been such a, you know, charged with such a big responsibility as well to tell his story. You've done a beautiful job. But also, given all that challenge, now you're charged with being the archivist of the footage.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's the film is made, and also you've you know, finished his films, the Burroughs film itself, Burroughs the movie in 1983. So that went out, didn't it, on release. And that came as part of this process as well.
Yeah, we were able to remaster the Burroughs film and put that out with the Criterion collection, which was great. Of course, in the process, I found Howard's second film, which is kind of a little-known documentary he made on Robert Wilson, the theater director, who in 1984 had been kind of semi-commissioned to do this huge mega opera for the 1984 LA Summer Olympics. And he's working on this huge production in 6 different countries creatively, while fundraising, because the Olympic Committee is being a bit tight because their last Olympics they lost money, and this one they want to make a profit. And Howard, is documenting this, not just Robert Wilson and his artistic process, but also this particular project. And in the end, it ultimately fails. And it's the only, huge project that Wilson really ever did that didn't come to fruition. But we have this kind of amazing film about it. So you see in Uncle Howard, I literally found these in Hamburg in an archive where the original soundtracks by Philip Glass and David Byrne were in an igloo picnic container in a supply room behind the toilet of this archive in the middle of nowhere. It was like, oh man, it's the state of film preservation is rough. So, so we have that. I wanted to remaster that, and essentially, in doing all this, we kind of created our own archive.
It's given you a lot of work, this discovery.
It's a ton of stuff. And, there's the Wilson film, the Burroughs, and then his last film, he was recording everything, the whole process of it, and even another project that was never made. So, but what happens is you get a very interesting picture of New York City from 78 to 89. And what's kind of great about it is, Howard was a filmmaker, so it was always kind of done with a filmmaker's eye. It was never really haphazard. There's usually a reason why he was turning on film camera, which is expensive, so you have to have a reason to turn it on, and even video, like why he was shooting this. So, yes, now we're like remastering old films and dealing with video and huge video archive. And I had like people come up to us saying, we're looking for footage of downtown New York in '79.
Yes. Got your little library going there, yes. Yeah. And so as an archivist at the BFI, I'm assuming it's all beautifully preserved for posterity. But you were saying some of the kind of art projects, you're doing some of the art projects.
Well, there's a very
using the footage.
difficult, there's a discrepancy we've discovered with archives, which I went through with Howard's film on Burroughs. We ended up finding the only long roundabout search. Ended up back at the Museum of Modern Art, which had one perfectly preserved, pristine print of it. But when it was discovered that this was the only print, and that the actual cut negative of the movie was still missing, we found all the other negatives, except the one thing we were looking. They didn't want to let it out of the archive at first, because the archive's job is to make sure this is protected. And so I entered into this very weird debate of like, okay, yes, but if people don't know about this movie and know it exists, what good is it having? And it's a real issue in the film preservation archive world. So having gone through such long efforts between the Burroughs film, the Robert Wilson film, getting the archive out of the bunker, which was a 1.5-year battle just to get it out of the bunker, let alone digitizing it, syncing it, the whole thing. It just feels wrong to just put it into an archive. So I want it to be used. So there are projects like creating visual lenticulars from some of the beautiful 60mm negative stuff, creating installations. We're planning that in London, and shows maybe to celebrate the Nova Convention, to make it relevant, and so that hopefully it can open up archives, so you can have archive in a space where it's used, it's interesting, and also preserved, because I would really like to break down that barrier, that divide, which makes it very difficult, both pragmatically and funding-wise, for filmmakers and archives to kind of coexist. I'm sure you ran into a lot of that.
Yeah. I mean, it's so much is like, normal doc is like, well, what's your access? It's exactly the same with archives. It's like most archive documentaries are kind of, it's interesting, what you don't get access to can sometimes provide part of the narrative, but it's getting access to archives is often incredibly difficult. That's a huge part of the archive producer's job, but just when you start in your role, it's like as the filmmaker, here you start really wanting to get into, but it is this kind of sense of preservation. It is difficult at times to get stuff out of the BFI. It is difficult at times to get stuff out of anywhere. You know.
Yeah, and then you run into the changing technology. So, very often the format that you have things preserved on becomes totally obsolete. And even, already you would be amazed how few people and facilities there are who can actually handle film, and how few people know how to work with it. It's kind of scary. So unless you have kind of this opening of doors between archives and filmmakers, you risk, all right, great, you've got a, nitrate print or 16, but if you've got in 2030 like a couple of old greasy machines and literally nobody anymore knows how to work with it, it's useless. So there needs to be a kind of merging of it so that the technology gets updated, and it needs to happen, otherwise we will lose a lot of stuff. It was a really eye-opening experience to me to see, how things are kept and locked away.
Yes, I see technical colleagues at work, and basically they're constantly fighting obsolescence.
Yeah.
And a lot of the engineers who really know these old machines, there's not so many of them around, and so it's a big struggle. So let's move on to Simon. So Simon, Challenger Disaster, Lost Tapes, an amazing film. One thing that really struck me as well watching it is that it was the sort of time frame is quite tight, and it is almost like this sort of capsule with this sort of explosive kind of nucleus that kind of but the whole thing is quite tight, and that kind of structure and the time frame, I think thematically adds such richness to it.
Yeah.
It's about this one event, but you don't go too far into contextualising the lead up and all the NASA, stuff that led to the Challenger project.
It gives it a great focus. What's fantastic about films like Amy and Senna is just focusing in on one individual in a real depth, so that you understand them in a way that you never could have before. And I'd say one of the things about the kinds of archive-led documentaries that we like to do on National Geographic is to find that kind of focus again. In this case, by essentially telling the events of one day. There is, a degree of backstory to it in terms of the preceding 6 months and the story of, Krista McAuliffe, the first teacher in space. But beyond that sort of little bit of backstory, to really, in as unmediated a way as possible, tell the story of, that day in January 1986. And I think that's what the filmmaker does brilliantly. I'm the commissioning editor. The filmmaker is a guy called Tom Jennings, who's based in LA, and he specialises in exactly those kinds of films. A really, really in-depth look at one single event in a way that hasn't been explored before. You get your science and engineering shows about O-rings and what caused the Challenger disaster to happen. You get all these different kind of interview-led docs. You get drama documentaries, but nobody's ever actually just put the footage together in one place so you can experience the event as it happened. I think it's worth probably playing the first clip, perhaps, just to get a sense of it. I think the thing to say about that clip is that you can see there's no voiceover, there's no drama reconstruction, there's no computer graphics. There's 2 text cards. I think there's 5 text cards about in the entire film. It's purely found sound and archive. So what's really positive from my point of view as a commissioner is that archive-led filmmaking is in a really healthy place, I feel, right now. But not just in the cinema. There's these fantastic feature docs in the cinema, but also there's a strong desire to have more archive-led filmmaking, whether it's in in 2-hour feature-length documentaries or in 1-hour specials or in series on channels, much more than I think there was before, and it might be partly to do with the success of films like Amy. But it means there's an opportunity, I think, at the moment to go back and look at all of those archives anew, and maybe that'll help with the preservation if we're making a few more films about them.
Indeed, yes. And one thing that was quite strongly used, that I thought was quite rare, was the use of still imagery in Challenger, and quite often that still imagery can jar if it's not used well or not used judiciously or creatively. But I just thought the way it was such beautiful use of Stillinger. I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think it's down to the skill of Tom, the director, and his editor. They've got a number of different techniques and approaches that they take to their films. I wouldn't say it's exactly rocket science, but they do it incredibly well. Sorry, excuse the pun. One of the techniques is, he always goes for those contact sheets, and you'll see in that first clip the contact sheets. And in a way, when you can see 7, stills from a single roll of film at the same time, in a way you're watching a film. I feel as a viewer, he loves those contact sheets because they give the opportunity to explore those moments where there isn't, moving image to tell the story. Another is, the found sound. I mean, he goes to radio stations, and in a way, the narrator of this show isn't a narrator because there isn't one. It's Jerry Little, who from Joy FM in Concord, New Hampshire. From Christopher McAuliffe's hometown, and he's never seen a shuttle launch. The only reason he's there is because of Krista. So you've watched that day unfold, as he is utterly, his jaw hits the floor with this sheer incredible feeling of watching a shuttle launch. And then you spend the second half of the film watching Jerry's world just completely fall apart. And it's, he's a radio reporter, and it's all about Tom just hunting down those sound archives and hunting down as well, the pieces of footage that nobody else has ever bothered to ask for or to show before. I think it might be worth showing the second clip as well and talking a little bit about that.
Yeah.
So, I think what's interesting there, you see the stills that you've just mentioned. You see the footage that everybody will ask for first. That's the White House press conference is probably not an easy, a very difficult thing to find. But then hidden in there is this CNN footage, and that's what's really interesting about what the director Tom has done there. It's CNN was a fairly young channel at the time. It's probably 5 years old. They were the only ones to actually broadcast the launch live. So you have that amazing on-air footage of the launch. But then, for some reason, they happened to decide that it would be a really, that when the disaster was unfolding, they were going to shoot behind the scenes, in the newsroom, and as their producers go mental trying to work out how to deal with the consequences of what's going on. And it's to Tom's credit that, when he phoned CNN and said, "What do you got?" and they said, "We've got this, 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 and this," because that's what they give to everybody who phones and asks for footage of the Challenger disaster. Tom always says, "And what else have you got?" And they said, "Well, we got this tape, but nobody's ever asked for that." So yeah, okay, we'll have that one. It's very similar to the way that I'm sure,
It's like everyone always talks about the driver's briefing moments in Senna, and it's a similar thing. People they always get asked for Mansell and Senna going like that, and it's like, well, I'm not interested in cars.
Yeah, exactly.
I want the people, and it's like,
exactly.
Okay, so yeah,
it's the mix of the iconic and the expected with the completely unexpected, and in a way, that's another thing that Tom does, is to avoid wherever he can the sort of Dan Rather CBS news, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock news piece that everybody has seen 50 times, and some people will kind of have in the back of their heads as they're watching the show anyway, but instead to show you something else.
It's. I mean, I always think where archive really works is that it changes the focus for you, because it's it becomes another filmmaker looking at something, as opposed to so the skill then in actually making the films is putting them all together to tell a story, but you are using, everyone's a cameraman for you. And a camera woman and a camera boy, and it's everywhere. It's CCTV, it's whatever, So it's But the contact sheets are great because to me I always loved it. It shows that it's not just a still image. It's not just one in isolation.
Yeah.
It gives you a context,
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I think also you just, as well as making it so real, these sort of unexpected moments, just that element of surprise and interest that's maintained through those creative
The
choices.
multiple dimensions, in a way. It's that's sort of 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the afternoon on the day, but you're seeing it in the Oval Office, you're seeing it in the press briefing room, you're seeing it on the streets of New York, and you're seeing it in behind the scenes in the newsroom at CNN. It's that kind of depth that I think is really strong, and I think it's interesting. I'd like to make this point. I think that's why archive, perhaps possibly why there's such a desire for archive-led filmmaking at the moment, is that in a way you watch this film, you experience the Challenger disaster in a similar way to the way you might experience a global or national tragedy today. Through so many different media. You experience it through Instagram, you see your updates on Facebook and Twitter, you put on your rolling news, and you go onto a couple of news websites when something catastrophic happens. And I think, in a way, that's what this film kind of attempts to recreate for a historic event, which is, I think, really interesting.
But build around it and personalise it. And at what point did, the teacher in space, I mean, she's the kind of emotional, you tethered to her through the whole film. Wasn't there a competition or out of 1,000 teachers auditioned, she was chosen to be the teacher who conducts a lesson in space.
Yeah.
And did Tom Jennings come with that idea, and that was the kind of almost like the log line with it, or did that come through the process of the...
He's made a few other films for us. He did the assassination of JFK, trying to avoid Walter Cronkite, and tell the story in a new perspective, which he's succeeded in doing. He's done some other films for other people, including one about Martin Luther King. The idea here was, it was the 30th anniversary, was it 30th? Yeah, of the Challenger disaster, was to cover the day. It was just, just as in Amy or Senna or in Uncle Howard, you're really being led by the footage and creating that film out of that footage, rather than saying, we're going to make this show and fit the footage in here, here and here. Yeah. It was just a case of Tom was led by the footage, and he found some astonishing other... unfortunately, there's not enough time for more clips, but there's footage of all the interviews with all of the other teachers who applied for the Teacher in Space program, and they're in the film, and they're being asked multiple choice questions and all of this kind of stuff. And you watch that footage, and again, it's terrible. It must be, I think it's probably VHS. I'm not exactly sure what the footage was on, but you watch those people telling, their interviewer how much they want to go into space. And you watch it thinking you really, really don't, because that's so the power powerful. Of going back to moments like that. Okay,
so can carry on with a more general discussion. One thing that's often overlooked, talking about any sort of filmmaking, is sound. And I just wondered if anyone chip in on any kind of challenges or epiphanies in the course of making the films.
I mean, for me, it's with sound is a lot of the time where I kind of begin in terms of, it obviously depends on the subject matter, but it's, for me, everything is archive. It's not just that I'm trying to find footage. It's kind of everything, so it could be contact sheets, it could be sound. But with sound, it's, say on Amy, what's very, well, actually on Senna, it's in, when we started making the film, we discovered that there was this American commentator for ESPN called John Bisignano, and it was interesting. We wanted to get away from Murray Walker and the sound of Formula One, which we already had. And I always had, actually, the sound in my head, my mum hates Formula One, because she describes it as round, round, like that. So it was like more we could get away from that. But this guy, John, was just asking simple questions that, well, you know, things like, so if you win this race, what happens next, Senna? It's like things that you really needed. So the bit of exposition, we didn't, rather than having title cards, we found in the archive that he was asking those questions. And then we reached that point, God, we actually really need a bit more. So we went and got him just to record some new sound for us, try to make it look like it or sound like it was archive. You know, and we did that in like 2 or 3 instances. Because, you know, the archive will, I think, you know, you trust the archive to tell the story for you now, a lot more than you did. But you always run up against, you do need a bit of exposition. You know, the audience needs to be put in that room where that piece of footage exists. And sound is brilliant for that. You know, it's there's a moment in Amy where we just use a radio reporter, and you say, oh, you know, introducing this new song by Amy Winehouse, and that's all we need. You know, and it's you know, it is archived, and it's kind of giving you that context, so that the radio clip we have is that it's as if you're driving along in a car, and we're trying to put you in that car in that moment, and so the audio can really do that for you.
And Aaron, you said a similar thing when you started talking about how sound was the first thing that you
it's literally where I began. And actually, we didn't show the clip, so maybe I'll show that, and you can talk about sound, because it's kind of in this clip is after the battle with John Giorno, and the stuff is out of the bunker. You start to see how I start breaking it down.
Wonderful.
So you heard there, like in the beginning, there were a couple audio bits that I knew when I just heard the sound. I liked, you know, the guy on the street saying, "Turn off those fucking cameras," you know. That's not just about how things looked, it's about the way they sounded too. And like the Bowery was notorious for being dangerous and filled with the Bowery bums who were like that. So I knew that. You get a guy screaming, "NYU film crew, look alive," you know, so, you know, it's very New York, and they were NYU film crew students then, so, like, you know, keeping these little sound bites in mind, they're just as, like you're saying, they're gems just as much as a good piece of footage, and it adds, in some ways, I mean, look, you know, half of any movie is sound, so it's just as important, and
I think perhaps it's possibly even more important in some ways. I think you probably have more leeway. You know, we're talking about VHS, you know, video, and really, really poor quality stuff. And, you know, I think you can probably get away with your really poor quality, you know, pictures, but you cannot get away with really, really poor quality sound in anything like the same way.
I mean, in an interesting way, the one thing that in archive that tends to be, you know, VHS and other tapes deteriorate, the audio tends to actually, it doesn't get compressed. You stick something onto YouTube, they never compress the audio. So, you know, there's loads of things in Senna where we took the audio just off YouTube. And I went back and tested it all the way through, and then went, actually, yeah, the sound edge is like, yeah, it wasn't compressed at all. So it's like, you know, you think of YouTube as an amazing sound archive as much as anything else. It's quite incredible.
Staying with you, Charles, just wondering, one of the questions I did want to ask was how YouTube has kind of affected the whole archival filmmaking.
For me, if you think that it's the world's biggest video library, and it allows you access that wasn't there before. You know, to the point that, say, a film archive like British Pathé just put all of their material on there, because they want, you know, it's about opening up. You know, the difficulty, of course, is that, you know, you often find there's this moment where, you know, you're looking through the cut of the film and it's like, okay, I can see the bits that the director and the editor have just pinched from YouTube and not told me. And that becomes quite difficult because, you know, the other masterclass would go into a bit more about, you know, it's the thing about archive, it's all owned by someone else. YouTube allows you to kind of get access into that. You have to be very wary then that you want to always be able to go back to a master tape somewhere. But I totally embrace YouTube, and it's where I begin every every project, if I'm honest. It gives you a sense of actually, because a lot of it on YouTube will be someone who's just a big fan of Amy will just put on one really interesting kind of clip from the news about Amy. Then you're like, okay, I want to see the wider picture. So it's giving you kind of keyholes into things a lot of the time. At least that's my, experience of it.
Yeah, it's definitely, I definitely got yelled at a few times, don't pull things from YouTube, 'cause we're going to have to source these. But, from an independent film perspective, if you don't have the luxury of having a brilliant archive producer, it's kind of amazing, because there were some things that I wanted to find from particular, periods in New York history that dealt with particularly AIDS coming in, where to go through the normal channels would be very, very difficult. It would add an impossible expense to an already impossible to fund, film, and it's helped in some ways, because I don't know so much here, but in the U.S. they have certain fair use laws for films, or if you need to use a clip and you're using it differently than you intended to, you can get away with what's called fair use. But the big obstacle that was always against the filmmaker was you still need something to show. So if you assume you go to NBC and say, I need this, it's like, well, you're in that game. So not that you can take things off YouTube because there's it's low res usually, but if you can play with it in a certain bit, it's just having another tool at the filmmaker's disposal, which is great.
Well, I
think also, sorry, just to add, I think YouTube's also created, I think it's trained the viewer in a way to appreciate footage of any quality, because that's what you see on YouTube. And it means that, archive filmmakers, I think, probably can get away with a lot more because of YouTube, and that's a fantastic thing, because it opens up those archives and makes their job just that little bit easier. When you're constrained to only tell the story using archive footage, it helps to be able to use more of it, and being able to use footage of any kind of quality means that you can say what's going to best tell the story rather than what looks the best.
People used to talk about an MTV generation. I guess there's a YouTube generation, and we've grown up and we will look at things in different qualities. But then also, I last time I met someone, when we worked together, there was a very quick turnaround documentary for, was it Nat Geo or was it Discovery?
Discovery.
And all about the Fukushima nuclear reactor, so there was this tsunami, then the entire film couldn't really have been made without YouTube, because we needed those people on the ground filming their own material and then uploading it to YouTube.
That was about as different as an archive program as you can possibly imagine from any of the three you've seen today. That was try and make a program about the Japanese tsunami in 2 weeks, start to finish.
Then we've got to tell the story of the reactor. We've got to tell all this science stuff and graphics, and then you've got, jaw-dropping kind of stuff of people just filming their houses being destroyed and that kind of thing. And then you think, well, thank God for YouTube, because they're actually uploading this. There's no film crew in the world.
I don't know about thank God. We'd have had like a month or 6 weeks to make it if we didn't have YouTube.
It does.
Because of YouTube, we now have to make it in 2 weeks.
It has. It's it's interesting what you were saying. From the Challenger clip, it's like news coverage now. If an event happens, you're expecting the whole work straight away. It's like before you're expecting the story and UGC clips and this and that and everything straight away, and you're expecting this kind of 360 archive world of something immediately. Whereas of course we all know that generally takes some time. Hopefully longer than a week is what we know.
So when you need a tornado, you can find it on YouTube.
But it's one of those things people do go and we were talking about this before. There was a clip which always stays in my mind of so we'd just done this 1 week of telling the Fukushima disaster, and we did it so well. They went, there's this, I think it's something like 200 tornadoes in one day.
Yeah.
Simon was about to have his baby at the time, and so everything was this kind of perfect storm. But you know, whoever the commissioner was, I think that one might be Nat Geo, went, right, no, go and, you know, just, we need to tell this story. But of course, you know, tornadoes turning up, people get their iPhones out and go and film them. And this one girl decided on her way to work in McDonald's that she would go storm chasing on the way to work. So she had a camera on the dash, and she found one, and it picked the car up and twisted it round and threw all over the place. And all the time that the camera's rolling, there's this incredible shot because the camera falls onto the ground but still is pointing upwards, and she is shaking. In terms of sound, she's not in the picture anymore, but the car doors sprung open and it's ding, 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 and her hand is just quivering in the corner of the screen. And I found that just because, you know, I'm in London, I'm not over there, and I'm just looking at YouTube. She went to work and uploaded that to YouTube that afternoon. And from the info that I kind of got from the YouTube clip, I could work out, okay, she was here, she says she works in McDonald's, she must be in one of these 4 McDonald's. So I just started phoning them. And then we got the producer who was there on the scene to go and interview her the next day. So that's, you know, YouTube really creating an important part of the show, an archive kind of driving it. But, you know, it's but then you could spend months trying to find whoever uploaded that and have no success whatsoever. Yeah, and then it's stuck in the, you know, and you're there as the archive person going, how the fuck do I do this? I don't know who they are.
I think there was another one where it was with the Japan tsunami where there was a great piece of footage on YouTube, but sort of within 10 minutes of it being uploaded, I think it was Fuji or somebody bought the footage, and decided they weren't going to license it to anyone, so we couldn't use it. Yeah,
it's, you know.
Right, I'd love to give everybody here the opportunity to ask some questions. So, if you just wait for the mic, the lady there.
So I think in all of your films, it's pretty clear that we sort of know what the end is likely going to be before we even see the movie, right? Like all of them end in death to a certain degree. And I'm wondering specifically in archive, how do you use that to play off of like where are our emotions without taking us to a dark place straight away all the time?
It's an interesting one because it's always, I mean, from the actual pitching process, it helps if you know the ending of the film. But from the actual making of it, you've got to. It is interesting. I mean, somewhat with Senna, we all knew the ending. When we started showing it to people in America, they had no idea who Senna was, and their reaction to him dying at the end of the film was quite incredible. But you don't, I think. For us, we don't kind of, because it's not really scripted in that respect, so you're kind of trusting that you're going to take the audience on a journey. It's, but yeah, you don't, I guess it's what perhaps they are, because, all the clips we've shown are about kind of shocking, kind of, the Challenger, Amy dying quite young, and Senna dying young as well. It's like, you've got to care. I mean, part of the archive is that if it's done well, you kind of fall in love with what you're watching, and the person, especially if it's like Senna and Amy. As Simon said before, it's like if we did Mansell, the movie, it probably wouldn't get, because a lot of it is about characters. So it's that, it's no different really to other films. It's like, it's about your casting as much as anything else. So, the power of the archive only really works hand in hand with the power of the story in general. I don't know if that completely answers your question. But.
I think in a way it's about, as well, it's just about what are the most powerful emotional stories, the most likely to engage an audience, and life and death. Life, death, going to prison, going down for murder. All of these kind of subject matters are really powerful, gripping subject matters, and it's hard. With the Challenger film, I'd say that Krista McAuliffe's story kind of jumped out eventually. It was to tell the story of the whole thing, but Krista provided the most powerful emotional through line in the film, because you watch her joy and hope and expectation, and you watch that sort of crumble and fall apart in the most tragic circumstances. It's that particular film. it's hard to find the joy in that sense because you have a deep sense of foreboding, and it's probably not the job of that film. It'd be great to see some archive-led docs that that do have happy endings, though. That would be a good thing. There's a few we're working on at the moment.
The commissioners need to work on.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about that. There's a couple we're working on at the moment. A few of them are quite dark. But there is at least one that has some fun in it. I can't talk about it, unfortunately, because it's a delicate stage of the process. But let me assure you, there is fun to be had in archive.
Yeah, in a way, I would add. I mean, that in some ways, that was the kind of mantra that I had approaching mine, because it leads to a kind of reflection that Howard has before he's going to die, where he's saying, you know, what life is. It's not so bad to live a short life as long as you do what you want with it, and I did. And I found that early on as a letter he had written to his parents, and tried to invoke in the beginning of the film that emotion that both the people that start to make up his story that you see present day are left with, and that I felt as his nephew wanting to find out, so that the audience is with you. And it's such a relief when you start to find stuff and get in there, because then you discover how alive his story was. So in a sense, you know, the archive functions as, you know, the life, you know, not what has been buried and forgotten. It's what you made with your life, what you did with your life, and how it can outlive you and kind of uplift, really.
There is there is a sense of being a detective in all of this. I mean, the whole thing is that, you know, you might know the ending, but you don't necessarily know the story. And I think that's where it always works really well. I mean, it sounds a bit trite, but I think it is true, you know.
It's about searching for the coda as well. It's just something to just very quickly add. I mean, Krista McAuliffe there was a backup teacher who features in the film, and she shadowed Krista throughout the 6 months of training, and you see her watching the launch and watching the disaster. In the end, we very nearly used her story as the end of the film, and we didn't, but we could have, because she eventually went into space 10 years later. So it's about searching for those ways, you know, in dark films like that, searching for ways to find some kind of redemption, and that's an example in that film.
Okay, can we take another question?
So I'd like to know your opinion about using archive where you actually treat it in some way, because there's a lot of controversy in terms of some people believe it has to be pure as it is, and I think, Paul, you mentioned maybe you actually blow something up sometimes. But how about if actually someone's taken an image, if it's in the right context, it's a building, and there's some archive, just using this example, of this building, and then later on there's a fire. So someone, I'm talking about, this is kind of years ago, a bit old-fashioned filmmaking, perhaps, in a way, but they actually put some fire on it in post. Do you think that is actually bad use of archive? Do you think that's kind of taboo for documentaries?
Well, it's, I mean,
we have our fashions, of course.
Yeah, I mean, every time you take, you know, if you look at the idea that everything is archive, I mean, when you take a photograph, when you shoot some film for your documentary, and you give it to the editor, and then the colorist, I mean, every film is manipulated. So you know, as long as your, you know, archive isn't I guess it's the thing, you know, documentaries in general, being precious about something, a truthfulness. I don't think there is. I think it's, you know, archive, I think, actually, I mean, hand on heart, having worked on all types of documentaries, the archive-led ones are by far the most truthful, you know.
I think also, I mean, you want to create a seamless viewing experience as possible, because you don't want that experience to be jarring for the person watching it. So with the resizing, you know, Challenger's full of 4:3 footage, and we pushed in, you know, panned and scanned, because the last thing you want to do is cut between different frame sizes. The viewer just doesn't know how to watch it. I think it's vitally important that we wanted people to feel like they were there, and so you don't want them to any time be saying, "Hey, wait, whoa, that didn't cut with that because it was a completely different colour," or, you know, etc. So I think it's really, really important to do that kind of job.
It's a bit case by case though, because I mean, I had as a filmmaker and dealing with a filmmaker's work. So 16 millimeters and 4:3. But this is a story, Uncle Howard, is about someone's life and also the work they created. So it was important to preserve the work, and the aspect ratio is important because you lose information. So it was a mix. In some cases, we would shift, aspect ratios, but in that way, it's actually accentuating the story because it's a story about someone's work as well. But then, of course, you work with it, and then actually in post, you try to find, or we tried to find a kind of, because when you're dealing with so many different things, you're trying to find some commonality. So you find a kind of template of how you're going to treat everything to make it work like that.
That's a good point.
Okay, we've got time for another one or two questions. Yeah.
What responsibility do you guys feel like you have to ensure the future of archive as like directors, producers, and
To ensure, one, I love working with it, so perhaps, if in any way the films I've been involved in have made archive filmmaking, more accessible and that people want to do more, great. I was actually at an award ceremony recently where I was talking to film preservation guys from France, and what they do is they preserve film, because the best way of preserving film still in this digital age is on film. It's tough to preserve VHS. It's tough to preserve all these other things. I think we really need to start thinking about that. At the moment, if you're going to preserve, it was a few years ago, the BBC had all these VHS viewing tapes. They were going to throw them all away. They've now started realising that actually some of that's master material now. So you have to, at the moment, the best way to preserve archive is to start copying it and putting it and digitising it. But I don't think that's, looking ahead, because when you digitize something, it becomes binary. They're even looking at weird things like turning it into DNA, and there's whole weird ways of looking at this. But you have to understand that eventually archives will disappear. As filmmakers, we're very much on the other side of it. I don't, I'm not a preservationist, I'm not a conservationist, but I hope that by something like YouTube, actually, if you are asking people. Whenever I'm making a film, I'm teaching with other students. It's like, why aren't you filming the filmmaking? It's like, that's a brilliant story there. It's like, this is full of documentary filmmakers now. I know there's a camera there, but I'm always looking for the coverage. I want other angles to cut around. So it's like, by encouraging people to make more films, you are encouraging them, hopefully, to preserve archive as well.
I think, there is this, like we talked about earlier, if you're a filmmaker, you have a lot of work, and you're on to the next thing always. Yeah. And it's very difficult, even your own archive. But at some point, it's a massive problem, really, because
you create your own archive, don't you?
Yeah, and it's expensive, and it took Martin Scorsese, I think, lobbying for 3 years to preserve and remaster Lawrence of Arabia. And it's big stuff we're talking about. So it's an ongoing thing. I think as a working filmmaker, you also have a responsibility to try to preserve the past, because it's what everyone's made.
From my point of view, I think I just need as many people to come to me with brilliant ideas for archive shows, so we can find ways to fund them, so that people can go and find these amazing sources of archive and digitise them and preserve them.
There's something romantic about the idea that archive is ephemeral, and you don't want to get. Although most of my work is in archival filmmaking, I'm very much not a remember when person. I want people to create new stuff. I love using older material to create new stuff. But at the same time, that the future archive will only exist if people go and shoot something. So you've got to get that balance right. Yeah. You can't preserve everything, otherwise, what happens? We become a nostalgic society, which I think we might be in this country. But yeah.
And for my part, while we have archives, I would encourage people, when you make a film, to deposit it in an archive. And sometimes that can be a responsibility taken on. This filmmaker came to see us recently, and he'd lost He'd lost a drive
back
with all
it
his
up.
original
You know,
materials.
so you know your drives. I say this to
Mm.
everyone. Your little lacy, rugged drive is like a car battery. If you don't use it, it will die. It'll be gone. If you think it's there, it's safe in that drawer at home. It's not. It will be gone in 10 years.
I think I
So
got to
we-
go
I
home
think
now.
we-
And,
I think we have to. Oh.
Excuse me, I just want to say quickly what you're saying. I've been told recently the archives I've got on the drives, I didn't realise you have to turn them on periodically.
Yeah. It's like
So
a
I
car.
think it's something
It's like
to
a
work
car
with.
battery. It will run down. It won't start. Yeah.
Someone warned me that. And do you know what?
Every 2 years, change. Put them on something else. Have backups. Everything.
Okay, well, thank you so much to the panellists. It's been-